Hi, welcome to For Better for Verse, the podcast where a married couple takes on the scriptures. I'm Justin Crisp.
I'm Jewelle Bickel, and today we are looking at Luke chapter 6, starting at verse 12, and then into the seventh chapter.
So today we've got a really packed episode because we're dealing with the heart of Jesus's teachings. We get Luke's telling of the Sermon on the Plain. This follows his calling of the 12 apostles. That's where we will begin. Then we will take a closer look at the Sermon on the Plain, the Beatitudes, his famous teaching about loving your enemies, turning the other cheek, and so on. And then we get two healing miracles. We get the healing of the slave of a Roman centurion, and we also get the healing we actually get the resurrection, or at least the resuscitation of a mother's only son
Mhm,
who has died. We mentioned last time that Luke says that the sermon happens on a plain,
mhm,
on a level, in a level place. This is
mhm.
different from the Gospel of Matthew, which has the more famous setting for this sermon, which is on a mount. In Luke, Jesus actually starts out on the mountain. It says that, as it has said many times, that Jesus went out to the mountain to pray. This is chapter 6, verse 12, and he spent the night in prayer to God. As soon as he comes down from the mountain, he calls the apostles Simon. This is verse 14 of chapter 6. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. We meet some of these characters earlier on in Luke's gospel. Last week, we met Simon, whom he named Peter, and James and John. Although you were noticing maybe we didn't meet Simon's brother Andrew.
Right. There's no mention of Simon's brother Andrew in the earlier chapter in the calling of fishers of men, as it
Mhm.
were. So we can assume he was probably there tagging along, but his name doesn't get mentioned. So who knows? Maybe that was the day he took a day off or
We
something.
really
We
don't
don't know.
know.
We don't know.
But in any case, Andrew is now tagging along with
He's
Simon.
part of the crew now.
James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were part of Simon's fishing
Yes, they were
company.
partners with him. That's what it says in Luke chapter 5.
Few, we were saying last time, could be Levi, who is the tax collector whom Jesus called. Those are often thought to be the same person, Matthew and Levi. Thomas, the infamous doubting Thomas. We'll get to that story later on. Maybe an unfair epithet for Thomas, but that's the Thomas we're talking about. We all know Judas Iscariot, who betrays Jesus, and that's how you get his description there. Luke calls him a traitor already. And you get Simon, who is called the Zealot. And I wanted to slow down on this for just a minute because I love the fact that there was a zealot among the 12,
Of course.
and I love that there was a tax collector among the 12. I talked about this a little last time. Just to say, some scholars say we don't really know what it means for this Simon to be called the Zealot. I know it can get a little confusing as you try to follow it home, but this Simon is not the Simon Peter, who's the fisherman. This is a different
Different
Simon.
Simon.
So you got Peter the fisherman, and you got Simon the Zealot. And the Zealots were a party of Jewish revolutionaries who fought in the Jewish-Roman War, which took place between 66 AD and the year 70. Just to be clear, this was a complete failure for the Jews.
Didn't go well.
Did not go well. The Romans destroy the Second Temple. The Jews lose. It's really
It's
pretty
a
bad.
big loss.
Horrible. I
Yeah.
mean, dramatic for the nation and so on. But the Zealots were part of this anti-Roman revolutionary party. That's 66. This gospel is depicting events that happened sometime between the year 30 and the year 33, thereabout. So we're 30 years from the Jewish-Roman War, 30 years potentially from, the Zealots really coming into being as a political party, as it were.
Mhm.
So maybe that when they say Simon, who was called the Zealot, he's just zealous for God or something like that. But I don't know. I kind of think that because the Gospel of Luke was written later, it's written after the Jewish-Roman War. It's written around the year 100, sometime between 90 and 100. the author of Luke could have been looking back at Simon and saying, okay, he was like a proto zealot. He didn't like the Romans. He had a revolutionary attitude. We would call him now a zealot. I sort of think he is a zealot. And I think it's important that Jesus has called as members of his inner circle both a tax collector who was on the Roman payroll and somebody who wanted violently to overthrow the Romans. Because I think as we go on in the Gospel of Luke and in all of the Gospels, we're going to discover that Jesus's kingdom isn't an earthly kingdom, and it transcends all of
all,
that stuff.
all
It
the
calls all
earthly.
of them into question.
Mhm. Absolutely. No, I'm with you on that. That whether or not he's a zealot in the technical sense,
Hmm.
he at least has probably many of the same feelings and intuitions of zealots in
Of
that
the
way.
later zealots,
Yes,
yeah.
of the later zealots.
So, as we move into the sermon on the plain, it says that Jesus came down with them and stood on a level place. This is the plain,
The plane.
with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. So he's coming down to greet this crowd of folks who are, some of whom are his disciples, some of whom are maybe randos,
Yeah.
people who have heard his reputation. But
Mhm.
he goes on to address the sermon itself to his disciples.
Specifically, he looked up at his disciples and said, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," etc., etc. Now, I think we should probably know we've been already compared this to the Sermon on the Mount.
Hmm.
Scholars tend to think that this all came from the same sort of conversation, same sort of speech that Jesus gave, and that sort of little bits of it that sort of maybe felt more important to Matthew or felt more important to Luke, that those sort of stayed in, and that sort of explains the differences, if you will, between the two.
Because there are differences.
There are
And
definitely differences.
the first verse of the sermon that you read, which is chapter 6, verse 20, blessed are you who are poor. In the Gospel of Matthew, that's remembered as blessed are the poor in
Spirit.
spirit.
Yep. Yep.
And for Luke, it's just blessed are the poor. We're kind of playing an ancient game of telephone. These oral traditions are passed down and passed down and passed down. You also have some editing done by the authors of Matthew and Luke.
Hmm.
They have theological names for their gospels that might be a little different from each other.
Yeah.
But no historian disputes that this sermon actually did take place and that these two stories, even though they have differences in the text of the sermon and they have
Hmm.
differences in the location of the sermon, no historian disputes that at some point Jesus gave this really long sermon with these basic ideas.
Right. Right. They think that this definitely happened, and certain parts of it were sort of more important to different gospel writers.
And so, what are the basic ideas of the Sermon on the Plain? What are the basic ideas to your mind?
Um, that's a good question. So,
There's a lot here.
there's a lot. There's a lot going
That's
on.
why I asked you.
Thanks, sir. So one of the first things I think I noticed as a difference for Luke versus Matthew is that Luke has a very short list of beatitudes. There are four, right? Blessed are you if you're poor. Blessed are you who are hungry now, though who weep now, and if people hate you and exclude you because of me. Matthew's have much. He has much longer list, and you can also see Luke's version focuses very much on his concern with this, what we call the great reversal. We see it
Hmm.
first in the Magnificat, and this idea that God is going to be with the poor and uplift them,
Hmm.
and those who have many things will sort of be put down. And we see that then immediately because we also in Luke Gospel have the woes, right? This is not something that is taking place in Matthew. Is woe to you who are rich, woe to you who are full now, woe to you who are laughing now, right? Woe to you when all speak well of you. Again, very much going along with Luke's concern and his belief that God cares
Hmm.
deeply for sort of the most unfortunate, as it were.
Those who are in material suffering,
Yes.
bodily, economic, reputational, social. Luke's gospel is really depicting the side of
It's
Jesus
very
who feels for
physical.
those
Yeah,
folks.
it feels for the sort of physical suffering,
Yeah.
as it were.
And you get four blessed are yous and you get four woe to yous.
Yeah.
Matthew only gives you the blessed are yous. I think that there's something else that I would like to foreground here,
Uh-huh.
which is that a lot of the language that's in the Sermon on the Plain in general and in the Beatitudes and the woes in particular, the language is transactional. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. It's kind of like one-to-one correspondence between if you're suffering now, you're not going to suffer later,
Mhm. Mhm.
presumably in eternity, or whatever it is Jesus means by the kingdom of God here.
Mhm.
Complicated. We'll have to talk about that at another time. It's
Absolutely.
sort of one-to-one
And
transactional
it
language.
continues too, right? We go to verse 37. Do not judge or you will be judged.
Hmm.
Do not condemn or you will be condemned, right? So again, it's the one to one.
Yeah. But I think that Jesus's actual agenda is to use this language of transaction in order to throw one big wrench in the system of tit for tat. I think that he's trying to subvert the transactional way of thinking about life
Mhm.
using the language of transaction, because the way of life that he recommends to his disciples
Mhm.
is not transactional. It's love your enemies, do
Hmm.
good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Luke chapter 6, verse 27.
Mm.
And that is one of the Christian distinctives, right? There's a lot
Yes.
that Christians share with other religions, other religious traditions. The command to love your enemies is not shared by anybody other than us. I mean, we're the only ones. Christians are the only folks who say you're supposed to love your enemies. And if you love your enemies and do good to those who hate you, you are subverting
Mhm.
the tit for tat of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You're saying, like, okay, the buck of suffering is going to stop with me. And if I end up being poor, hungry, sad, hated, defamed, reviled, etc., God's going to take care of me. That's the point of the
Mm.
Beatitudes, is that if
Interesting.
I participate in this radical way of love for enemy, non retaliation, giving without any expectation of receiving,
Mhm.
even if I end up being on the, living the lowest of the low sort of human life, God is still going to take care of me.
Mm.
God's going to vindicate me, which is exactly what happens with Jesus.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, no, I think that that's really interesting. So, looking at verse 27, right? I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other as well. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt, right? And
Mhm.
it continues on. This is quite a famous, maybe infamous passage,
Infamous is good.
a passage for a lot of reasons. As you said, it is a Christian distinctive, right? It is something that Christians are told to do that other religions don't say to do. But exactly how we interpret that, right, is definitely up in the air. So I teach a class where we read through Luke and Matthew. And so we were talking about this a few weeks ago. And I asked my students, I said, do you really think, Jesus means it? If someone strikes your cheek, that you should offer the other one. Is this a literal thing? And one of my students looked at me and she said, well, if he meant it, he's wrong.
I love that.
Me too.
Oh,
And I was
man.
like, I mean, okay. Um,
At least she was being
she was
honest
being
about how she felt.
very
Yeah.
honest with it. And I think that is how a lot of people feel about that. They're like, well, if he means it literally, he's wrong.
I once had an eighth grade confirmation student say, "Who would live this way?" And it's a good question. Who in their right mind would live this way? Maybe none of us in our right mind
Maybe none
is
of
the
us in our
truth.
right mind. Absolutely. And I mean, this verse has also been used to keep people in bad situations for long times,
It
right? So you have
has.
to keep that in mind. But whether or not he means it literally for us, he does live it literally.
Wow, that's a great point. He really does.
He I mean, if you go few chapters on, where we'll be in a couple weeks at his trial and then his crucifixion, he prays for those who are abusing him on the cross.
Hmm.
He does not strike back anyone who strikes him. He doesn't try to defend himself. I mean, I don't know. He seems to live it literally.
You're totally right. He does. Regardless of whether we can debate all that we want about whether he means it literally for us, it was literal for him.
He did that literally.
It's in the Gospel of Luke that we get Jesus asking the one he calls Father to forgive those who are in the process of murdering him.
Yes,
Father,
yes.
forgive them, they know not what they do. I'm using today one of my favorite study Bibles, the C.S. Lewis Study Bible, which is uses the New Revised Standard Version, but it's interlaced with these excerpts from Lewis's
Ooh,
letters. And I know you and I are both big fans
thanks.
of old Clive Staples here. C.S. Lewis wrote a letter in January of 51, in which he says, in praying for people one dislikes, I find it helpful to remember that one is joining in Jesus's prayer for them. And that is true, right? Whenever I struggle, and boy, do I struggle with these particular passages, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
I don't want to forgive people who do wrong to me. I want even less to forgive people who do wrong to those whom I love.
That's right.
It's even harder. I want to I want to get back at them. I want what I think is justice, which is normally more like revenge,
Mhm,
okay?
mhm.
Less like justice, more like revenge, but I think is justice. It feels like justice to me. I want all those things, but Jesus prayed for his enemies, and if I can pray for my enemies, I'm just joining him in his prayer for them. The other thing I would say is that Jesus does live this out literally in his life, but he doesn't always live it out in the same way. So
Absolutely.
when people come to me for counseling,
Mhm,
particularly if they are in an abusive relationship of some kind,
mhm.
they often have questions about this. If Jesus says to bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you, to turn the other cheek, are they supposed to stay in their abusive situations no matter what? And my answer to them is that Jesus didn't always physically stay in the abusive situation, even while he did seek to pray for those who considered themselves or acted as though they were his enemies.
Mm, mm.
And an example of this we've already gotten in the Gospel of Luke. It was
Dur
chapter 4,
4, yeah.
yeah, verse 30. This is where Jesus was preaching in the synagogue in his hometown of Nazareth, and he preaches a sermon that makes everybody mad. And the crowd in the synagogue drove him out of the town, led him to the brow of a hill on which their town was built so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But verse 30, chapter 4, but Jesus passed through the midst of them and went on his way. That's one way that we can live
Mm,
out loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you, and so on. Jesus could have in that moment rained down fire from heaven on that crowd, right? He
absolutely.
could have turned himself into the Terminator and not only prevented them from hurling him off a cliff, he could have mowed them down, and he doesn't. He passes through the midst of them. Passing through the midst of them means Jesus calls you to get out of your
Get out.
harmful situation. You
Absolutely.
can do that. It's too strict an interpretation, even of Jesus's literal application of this teaching to his life, to say you have to stay physically in abusive situations.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there's many times where crowds come up to him and he just disappears, right? We see this
Yeah,
frequently.
like he apparates in Harry
I
Potter.
know, that would be nice. Yes, I don't think that this is saying to us that we specifically, as sort of Christians, currently need to take this literally. I think the fact that he lived it literally, right, is, well, he's God.
And in some ways, the fact that he lived it
It
literally,
means we don't have to.
amen.
Mhm. Absolutely.
I think there's a hermeneutical or an interpretive T. It's verse 36 of chapter
Yeah,
6.
absolutely.
Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Backing up just a little more, he's talking about loving your enemies, doing good and lending, expecting nothing in return. He
Mhm,
says your reward will be great and you will be children of the Most High, for the Most High is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. This non retaliatory, non
mhm,
vengeful, always giving, always loving, unconditionally, always turning the other cheek, never an eye for an eye. That is the divine mode of being. That is
mhm.
what it means for God to be God. When God wakes up in the morning and God gods, this is what it is. This is what it means for God to God, and for God to be God is just to love,
Be merciful.
be merciful, unconditional. We have a marvelous parishioner at St. Barnabas who calls it unconditional benevolence. He just
Mhm.
gives and gives and gives. And I know you're a big fan, as am I, of the 13th century Dominican Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Thomas calls God maxime liberalis, maximally free-handed,
Forgiving.
always.
Absolutely.
It's just there's never there's it's impossible for God to begrudge anybody anything, because what it means for God to be is just to give away, to give being, first of all, as our creator, and then just to give and give and give and give some more. And Jesus is what that looks like in a human being.
It does.
And yeah, he does some great stuff, and he's compelling, and he's like, people can't take their eyes off of him, either because they want to follow him, or it's like you can't take your eyes off of a car accident. And he ends up dead and then resurrected. So it's pretty tall order to look like God in a human life. But
Absolutely. I think you're right that this is the key to the entire thing. Because if you take this, it says, he is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked, be merciful as your Father is merciful, and go back and apply it to all the Beatitudes and to the woes and to the love your enemies. It means that even when you mess up, or even when you're not living up to this perfect Jesus standard, God is merciful. God is kind.
one of my favorite prayers in our tradition, in the Anglican tradition, is the prayer of humble access, written by Thomas Cranmer, our first Archbishop of Canterbury, who was a Protestant, written by him to be said by the congregation before communion. And it says, "We do not presume to come to this thy table, O merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in thy manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table. But thou art the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy, whose property is always to have mercy." It's like God has a case of the can't help it. God can't help but to be merciful, because
That's God's nature.
It's who God is. It's the only thing that it means for God is to love. And sometimes that love looks like mercy when we have wronged him.
Absolutely. I think that the only other thing I want to know is from verse 39 right to 42, where he's talking about, you're focusing on your neighbor having a speck in their eye, whereas you have a log in your eye. And, we're talking about whether or not, does Jesus mean all this literally or not? My lovely study Bible, it has a line here that says, just so you know, this form of teaching is hyperbole. And so I'm glad that we can all agree that he's not saying we have to take logs out of our eyes. We may not know about the rest of it, but at least we know that.
Oh my
At least
God.
scholars can agree that that's not real.
That's really good. This is Jesus teaches often in hyperbole.
Always.
He is a shock to the system, right? And it's part of why he's so compelling. He does have this, you can't take your eyes off of him.
You're like, what's going to happen?
What's going to happen? I mean, this guy is crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so thinking about the healing of the centurion's slave here, what do you find noteworthy about the story?
Well, I've always loved this story. I think it's a beautiful faith that we see here in the centurion. And it's a quiet faith, too. It's not showy. It's just a no. I think it's interesting to note that the Jewish elders came on his behalf and said, he's a good man. He's been doing all these things for us. And I also think it's interesting to note then that he came to Jesus and said, Lord, you do not need to come into my home, because if he were to go into the home of a Gentile, he would have been considered unclean, right? And
wow. Oh, I didn't realize that.
And so it's interesting to me, at least, that if he has friends who are Jewish elders, right, then he would probably know that. The centurion would know that. And so him saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself, could possibly be even his way of saying, I know that this is not something that you do, but that's okay. I don't even need you to do this.
Oh, it's interesting. Okay, just so that we've all got the story straight in our heads. So Jesus concludes the sermon on the plain, and he goes into Capernaum. And there, the Jewish elders, who were friends of this Roman centurion, who's a Roman military officer, he would have commanded about 100 soldiers. Centurion, the Romans got clever about this. These Jewish elders, who were the centurion's friends, send word to Jesus. While Jesus is on the way, the centurion sends other friends, maybe these Jewish elders, maybe somebody else, to say to Jesus, don't trouble yourself. You don't have to come to my home. I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof. That is verse 6, chapter 7. And you're saying that could be because the centurion knows that for him to enter the home of a Gentile as a Jew would be seen by Jews as being defiling or making him ritually impure.
Yes, absolutely. And it seems that Jesus doesn't necessarily care. He was going.
You're right.
He doesn't seem to care, but I still think it shows the faith of the centurion, that even that, he says, no.
I kind of like the idea that the centurion is more cautious.
Is more worried about the Jewish law than Jesus.
He's more politically savvy.
Of course
he knows that Jesus is running around getting himself into trouble. And the centurion is like, dude, hold your horses. Can you cool it for a minute? I know you can heal this guy remotely, is basically what he says. He said,
It's
just
like
say the
click
word
the
and he'll be
button.
healed. He knows it doesn't matter if he's in the house or not. If Jesus just says the word, boom, he's going to be healed, and that's what happens. That's what Jesus does. And we get Jesus going afterward to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. This is verse 11 of chapter
Hmm.
7. And a man who had died was being carried out of the town. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. It says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, do not weep. Then he came forward, and Jesus said, young man, I say to you, rise. And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. I mean, it is a beautiful
Hmm.
story here. Here is Jesus again, not exactly with God's favorite parlor trick, right? As we were talking about it in our early episodes, that has to do with childbirth and
Right.
the vulnerability of it. But this is Jesus being super concerned for mothers. And in this day and age, the fact that her only son was dead would have meant she was economically
She
destitute.
had nothing, nothing.
She's grieving.
As a
She's also
widow, and then that she has no one to support her,
no
care for her.
husband, no son. And in this patriarchal society in ancient Rome, she's out on the street.
Absolutely.
It is a super tender thing, though. Jesus gave him to his mother.
Gave him to his mother. I know. Isn't that sweet?
It says, fear seized all of them. That's what it next says. And they glorified God. I do wonder, did fear seize his mother, young man's mother? Or was the young man's mother just like, could just completely overjoyed?
Yeah. I mean, it says fear seized them, and then they glorified God.
Mm,
So maybe, it could be like a awe kind of fear, not
mm.
the kind of fear where you're like scared and hiding from a scary movie, but kind of the when you just realize the extent of something, power.
Fear in the biblical
Fear
sense.
in the biblical sense, yes.
Yeah. And then it concludes with this word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. So, like it or not, he keeps hiding away in the
And everybody
mountains.
knows.
Everybody knows who he is. The centurion keeps, trying to
Protect.
say, dude, don't be so much a rabble rouser. It's okay. But it doesn't matter. Word is getting out about him, and he is going to be forced to live out the Sermon on the Plain in a literal way
Mm,
very quickly here.
very soon, yes.
I think that's all the time that we have. This is For Better for Verse. We're so glad that you've been with us. Please like, share, click subscribe, however it is you get your podcasts. Help us to share the grace of the God of the Bible with the world in great need of Him. Till next time, God bless you.